Morning glory and evening grace, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. It is Election Day, and I will cover it extensively throughout the program. But I want to begin on a sad note. Former Vice President Dick Cheney died today. He has been the equal of any public servant in the United States for more than 40 years, one of the great weight-bearing walls of the Republic, and in a variety of posts. The youngest chief of staff in the White House ever for President Gerald Ford, a staunch conservative and leadership member of the House of Representatives, including ranking member on the very important Iran-Contra Committee, backed up by future federal judge Dick Leon. He and his steady leadership helped President Reagan guide through that. When George H.W. Bush became president, and he needed a Secretary of Defense. After John Tower withdrew, the senator from Texas, he turned to the congressman from Wyoming, and Dick Cheney became the model of a successful Secretary of Defense, oversaw the planning and execution of the first Gulf War, and then, after H.W. was defeated in 1992, went into the private sector, succeeded magnificently because he's a smart, brilliant man. I'll tell you a little bit about his education adventure in a second, and that's what he called it. After that, of course, George W. Bush asked him to oversee the vice presidential selection process, at the end of which George W. Bush asked Dick Cheney to join him on the ticket because he thought he needed someone with that level of gravitas and seriousness, and the vice president did. And he served loyally and quietly, advocating steadily for his robust foreign policy. After the 9/11 attacks, he was an absolute advocate for striking America's enemies before they could strike us. Not unlike what's happening in Israel now. They have decided in Israel now to take people at their word. And Vice President Cheney was always an advocate for the unitary executive, always an advocate for using American strength for the invasion of Afghanistan, for the invasion of Iraq. Defended it always, had good arguments. In his retirement, he took on the Obama foreign policy, especially the JCPOA, and he was right. Wrote a number of books and quietly supported Republicans, just as he quietly supported George W. Bush throughout his presidency. I had the great honor of getting to know him. I first worked for Mrs. Cheney when she was director of the National Endowment for the Humanities as her general counsel. She's an eminent historian. The Virginia Dynasty is one of those books I'll reread and reread or listen to again because it's such a fabulous book. But she wrote a number of great books. And her book on Madison is really, I think, probably the high watermark for Madison scholarship in the United States. He loved his two daughters and his grandchildren. Both Liz and Mary have been guests on this program. And the vice president was a guest many times. In the White House, he invited me to his office, and I went and recorded an interview there, and then he and Mrs. Cheney hosted the Fetching Mrs. Hewitt and I at the Vice President's residence, along with the Powerline fellas. We had a great dinner one night up at the Naval Observatory, which is now the Vice President's residence. He also came to the studio after his days as Vice President were done when he didn't have a heart. He made a joke about it. He'd written the book Heart, and he and Liz came to my California studio carrying the device which kept him alive until a successful heart transplant. And the book Heart was about how American medicine had kept him alive for a very long time. One step ahead of heart disease, always with some innovation, concluding with a heart transplant which worked for a very long time. And when I returned to run the Nixon Foundation, the vice president was very gracious with his time, helped me get it reordered and stood up, went out to his home in Northern Virginia, had lunch with him. Fabulous guy. One semester I was teaching at Colorado Christian University, and Bill Armstrong, former senator, good friend of Dick Cheney, was leading CCU, and Bill and I invited him to come out to, it's a small college in Lakewood, Colorado. And the vice president always kept that ledger in his head about, okay, who's done well by him and his family and by the Republic, and Bill Armstrong certainly had. So he came out, We had 4,000 people. It was amazing. Modest, humble, no braggadocio, steady, and a 5-star intellect. Like I said, a weight-bearing wall of the Republic. Of course he has critics, anonymous, sometimes non-anonymous. Anyone who's going to live in the public square and do battle on behalf of the Republic for as long as Dick Cheney did, in as many different roles as he did, is going to have a lot of critics. There are going to be a lot of people who want to stand up and say, Dick Cheney this, Dick Cheney that, and they're all wrong. You can't be perfect in your decision making. Nobody is. But boy, he was loyal. He was very, very loyal. He did have disagreements with President George W. Bush, and they're well known. He did a fabulous interview with me after his memoir came out. It's a great memoir. Good friends with Donald Rumsfeld, as one would expect. The men had worked together since the Nixon administration. Great admirer of Jerry Ford. Great admirer, actually, of every Republican, not so much President Trump. They had profound differences. And the vice president, though, conducted himself in the opposition to some of the initiatives of the Trump first presidency quietly with dignity. He was just a magnificent person. Now, what I like to let people know, he was a wild boy. Born in Nebraska but raised in Casper, Wyoming. He was a lineman after he dropped out of Yale, before getting thrown out of Yale. So he's very smart. Got into Yale and then suggested that he go home. He did. I believe he worked as a lineman for a while. His high school sweetheart, Lynn Cheney, was out there. And I think it was Mrs. Cheney who suggested to him, Dick, you really got to straighten up. And he did. Went to the University of Wyoming and then became a congressional fellow. I'm recalling this from memory, right? So I'm not really sure about this, but I think he became a congressional fellow for Congressman Steiger, Wisconsin, and then decided, I'm not going to be a PhD. I like this congressional business, and went into the Nixon administration with Donald Rumsfeld at the Office of Economic Stabilization. It was the Wage and Price Control Administration, I think, which was a ludicrous idea, but RN wanted to try it. And then when Rumsfeld led the Gerald Ford transition, he brought Dick Cheney along, and then former President Ford asked Donald Rumsfeld, would you go over to defense? He said, sure, but who's going to run the White House? And they said, well, Dick Cheney can run the White House. 34 years old. Ran the White House staff. Not in a different way, very, very similar way to Susie Wiles, who is running the White House now for Donald Trump, and you never see her. She's not interested in making news. She is interested in making the West Wing run. Vice President Cheney was big on process, big on preparing for a crisis. And he'd like to remind everyone, after 9/11, the homeland was not attacked again. To his critics, especially those following the invasion of Iraq and no weapons of mass destruction, he would routinely point out, we took up as our duty, and W and he said it many, many times, the homeland will not be attacked again, and we have not been since the efforts undertaken by President Bush and Vice President Cheney. Strong believer in the executive branch. Strong believer in Article 2. And with the intellect to back up any argument. Never touched electronics. Never, ever touched it. And I got the great, great, great compliment. Every interviewer loves this compliment. That's a great question. I've never been asked that before. And I asked him, the question was, if you had to give up fly fishing or pheasant shooting, which would you keep and which would you let go? And he said, oh, that's a great question. I have never been asked that question. And he thought about it for a long time. I'd gone to the White House, and a friend of mine had made him some flies. And he took the box later at dinner that night. He said, I open boxes like that with trepidation because some people are not so good. But it's a good box, English box, and they were great flies. But after a while, he said, but if I had to do it, I'd give up fly fishing, but I love them both. Great pheasant hunter. But more importantly, a great patriot, great statesman, a genuine, honest-to-goodness statesman who loved his wife, his children, his grandchildren very, very much. A model of a man. And if he had his wild years, I think I heard John Podhoretz say today, don't worry if your teenagers run a little bit wild. So was Dick Cheney, and that turned out very, very well for the country, for his wife, and for his family. He will be greatly missed. I'll be right back on Election Day. It's Hugh Hewitt.
Portions of the Hugh Hewitt Show are brought to you in part by Conservatives for Lower Healthcare Costs.